Fabian Schuppert from Queen's University Belfast to talk about risk avoidance through transition, legitimate expectations and issues of justice. Over to you.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organisers for inviting me. It's great to be here. Second of all, as you can see, my title changed ever so slightly. I talk about risk management, not risk avoidance, for reasons that hopefully will become clear in a minute. Thirdly, I have to say that this is the first outing of the paper, so I used the invitation to present here to do something and write something about legitimate expectations, which is a topic I wanted to write something about for quite some time. So, but it's a first outing, so all the mistakes really are mine, and there are plenty. So I bank on you to help me out. And fourthly, when I saw the program, I obviously was a bit shocked because Simon is a tough act to follow. He's always so clear and makes it very easy for the listener to follow. So since I finished the PowerPoint this morning at 6:22, I hope, I'm not quite sure that my PowerPoint can deliver the same, but I'll try. So, right, so just to give you an overview, I start with the idea that we have to undergo climate transition, but I will very briefly talk about why I think that is actually necessary. And I think that in order to respond to climate change, there are certain transitions necessary which will occur rather swiftly and might be rather radical in nature. And there are, of course, many other transitions as well, but I will focus on one particular case, namely energy, and I will talk about that in a second. But when we do deal with climate transitions, one of the questions that always pops up is how shall we distribute the burdens, fair burden sharing, and potential benefits. I included that extra for Fergus. That is a question which quite often is dealt with quite narrowly, right? So coming back to one of Simon's ideas from an earlier piece there, he says, look, quite a lot of the climate justice literature is slightly isolationist. So they'd only talk about climate justice and they forget about other dimensions of justice. And I think that is certainly also true when one talks about, or when one reads some of the papers on distributing the burdens of climate transitions and so on. It seems to be there are costs stemming from this and how shall we distribute those, rather than thinking about what is already the state of society in which these transitions takes place. So that is something I try to avoid. At the same time, as I say here, I talk about energy, which might be considered atomist, which is the other worry that Simon flagged up in that paper back then, namely that you pick out one item and on a long menu and say, well, I'm only going to talk about this, rather than talk about everything else that needs to go on around it. So hopefully it's not too atomist, we will see. While I started out wanting to talk a lot about the distribution of burdens, it actually turned out that, and as I already said, that was kind of in the background anyway, that I say more about legitimate expectations. And one of the reasons for that is that quite often when you talk about the distribution of burdens in a society, somebody sooner or later puts their hands up and says, well, but what happens to all the people who have certain entitlements already or have certain expectations that things can carry on in a certain kind of way? What kind of changes do you propose, and why should society change so radically just because somebody believes climate change is real or something like that, or because you think you know what's just? These kind of challenges which are quite regularly thrown at philosophers, I think, when you present ideal theory type kind of arguments. Obviously, in this room, I probably don't have to talk about why we need transition. I have that on there just because it's important to me to flag up the 2 points which Simon also had at the very beginning of his talk, namely that we have an underlying justice concern, right? An intergenerational justice concern or a risk concern, namely that we want to avoid the dangers of climate change and its associated harms and risks. Possibly also we have good reasons to undergo an energy transition in our societies because of other risks. So if you think about nuclear energy, that's not only connected to climate issues. Quite a lot of people think the main risks connected with nuclear energy are actually about everything that follows once stuff is out of the ground and you actually use it in nuclear power plants, and then once you do after use with it. So there are other risks as well. That's just to flag that up. But if there's a need to come back to that point, we obviously can do that in the discussion. Now, the particular angle I take in this paper, and it has something to do with work I've done recently, namely that I've worked more on risk rather than justice, because I have the feeling there's a lot has been said about justice, the different kind of justice principles which we could advance in the context of climate change, climate justice, social justice, and I think they make very good sense. But I think it's also important to flag something up about risk, because climate change to a large degree is a risk issue. And that there are certain factors which probably also would become apparent if one talked about justice, but I think risk lends itself a little bit better to draw these out. So one is, and that is the reason why, for instance, the title of my paper changed, is that minimizing risk or complete avoidance of risk actually is not really a possibility, I think. So even when it comes to avoiding dangerous climate change, I always think, that's a bit weird. I mean, obviously we can try to turn back the hands of time, but the fact of the matter is climate change is already happening. There are lots of negative impacts. So to say you completely avoid the dangers of climate change is a bit strange. Then if you say you want to avoid dangerous climate change and you connect that to the 2-degree warming goal, then obviously you have the points which Daryl made yesterday. That's just a number. That's a bit arbitrary, and it's a bit weird to think 1.9 degrees is not a problem, 2.1 degrees is catastrophic, what we talked about this morning on the way from the hotel to the conference venue. So that's just why I think, even though it was in my title initially, I realized, no, that's actually not the way I want to frame it. I think it's more about risk management rather than risk avoidance. Another point, and that might strike you as slightly odd, that it says their society isn't like an airplane. There's a good reason for that, namely that life sometimes throws you these bones, and then you can use them in a paper. So when I sat in the airplane flying over from Northern Ireland to Paris, the pilot, who was in a very good mood, said, look, here comes the security demonstration. I know many of you have seen that before, but please pay attention and put on your seatbelts, all that. After all, we are all in this together, which doesn't fill you with confidence necessarily when you're sitting in an airplane, considering what your odds are if something goes wrong. But the interesting thing is that obviously society isn't quite like that. So in a certain way, of course, in society, we're all in it together. That sounds really nice. But the distribution of risk is very, very uneven. In an airplane, if things go wrong, the chance that we all die, irrespective of who we are, what our social positions are, is quite high. In society, if climate change hits us, it's fairly obvious, and I mean, John talked about that yesterday, that people are very differently affected. We have very different exposures to risk, but we also have very different vulnerabilities. And I think that's a point worth highlighting. Because it points to an underlying justice issue or an inequality issue, which is important if we think about the distribution of the burdens and benefits of an energy transition, because it links in with these other things. And there, again, it's something we discussed yesterday, so I only put it up very briefly here on this slide. Obviously, risk is multi-causal and it's cumulative, so it's not helpful to only look at one risk and say, oh yeah, well that doesn't look too bad, but actually it's about the exposure to different kinds of risk, different socioeconomic factors which link all together into a bigger conception of vulnerability. And quite often it's not that you can target one bit only, because all the individual bits don't seem relevant enough, but if you take the bundle together, you actually have quite significant social vulnerabilities, which might undermine people's fertile functionings, to use John's conceptualization yesterday. Now, when we talk about risk management in society, and I'm only going to talk about energy transition in state-based societies, so I'm not going to talk about the global today. it's obvious that we normally assume that the state has an important role to play. Why? Because the state is a key risk manager, that we assume that the state has a whole set of duties. That's not an exhaustive list, that these are just some which seem to matter in the context. So protecting its citizens, maybe creating and sustaining opportunities, or at least providing a framework which allows for people to develop other opportunities. So in a certain way, creating meta opportunities. Hopefully something like advanced justice. But then something which also seems to important, which we want from our states, in practice at least, is a certain kind of assurance, a certain kind of legal certainty or framework certainty, right? That things don't change too quickly. And that is a bit which comes, which I will come back to later when talking about expectations, because expectations, legitimate expectations, have a lot to do with that, right? So the state provides a framework for us, maybe with certain opportunities. What we make of these opportunities depends on all sorts of factors, but we assume that there's a certain kind of stable framework around, and there's a certain kind of certainty with regard to the norms, not only legal norms, but also other norms which apply and which structure our conduct and our chances and opportunities. Now, when you go to the burden-sharing literature in terms of climate justice, energy transitions, within the ideal theory camp, there are quite a few people who, I think, say very sensible things. So they say, look, the state needs to be sensitive that what normally happens with climate change harms and risks, namely that the poor are the ones which suffer most, which are actually put into more vulnerable positions, that doesn't happen. So in a paper, for instance, which Alex Brown wrote, he goes back to an old Buchanan paper who says, well, institutional change in society should kind of follow the Rawlsian difference principle, which basically means institutional change must benefit the worst off. I'm not sure that's the right way to conceptualize what the state shall do in cases of transition. One worry, obviously, is if you only focus on the worst off, you only focus on one particular group, you might not worry about what happens in between. So the politics of the squeezed middle, right, where we don't take from the very rich and the rich, but we actually squeeze the middle a bit more to make sure that we help the worst off. Something like that could happen. I think a better way of thinking about what roughly our intuitions about justice, and I try to be ecumenical here, so to speak, is to say we care about the overall risk distribution of vulnerability. And I kind of follow here things which John and I actually discussed yesterday over dinner, namely that there's probably a good reason to think there are certain needs which basic needs need to be fulfilled first, and then you tackle other objectionable inequalities. And you can track these quite well with the help of having a better understanding of how different socioeconomic, environmental, biological factors influence people's vulnerability. And so basically what you try to do, even though you know that data collection is never perfect, is try to amass data, square it with your normative principles and say, okay, here are people we can help. And then you find some of these burden-sharing papers which are awfully optimistic, and they say, look, there's no trade-off between climate change transition or also mitigation and adaptation and social justice. We just need the right kind of normative framework to square all that. And that all sounds nice and rosy, and if that were the case, I could stop here. However, I'm not sure that is the case, at least in terms of how the debate often works. Because quite often then people say, hold on a minute, what about people's legitimate expectations, right? So it's all nice and well that we're nowadays all egalitarians. It's all nice and well that you say if you change from a fossil fuel-based economy to renewables, what you want to do is, if that leads to rise in energy prices and then energy services possibly as well, that you make sure that you subsidize that somehow and you help the not so well off in being able to access energy and energy services. But how is it really then in terms of the burden sharing? So is it the case that we can say some people are worse off, some people are better off, the better off have to shoulder a bigger part of the burden, Do they have any kind of claims to compensation if they, for instance, lose business opportunities or if people are put out of employment? So there might be cases, and I think there are actually quite a few cases, where rather radical changes in the process of energy transition are going to affect quite relevantly people's expectations. And then obviously we have to find out whether they're legitimate expectations, but let's first talk about expectations. So Lucas Meyer and Pranay Santlecha, for instance, have written on the role of legitimate expectations in climate change, 2 papers, and they focus on the expectation E, they call it, that you are able to emit a certain amount in the future. Now, personally, I think that's the wrong way of framing it, because it again seems to fetishize emissions, right? Rather, what you care about is that you have access to certain goods, that you can fulfill certain functionings, have certain capabilities, these kind of things. So maybe it's not a good and helpful way to talk about everybody has a certain expectation that they continue to emit whatever, because you have things like a certain substitutability and so on. The more difficult bit is that certain ways of life, certain, so be it like flying around in airplanes all the time, might not be possible anymore, or certain business opportunities might not be available anymore. So digging stuff out of the ground and turning it into money and energy might not be possible anymore. Working in certain professions might not be possible anymore, which is really difficult if you spend your life first being trained for that profession, then work in it, and then all of a sudden you're unemployed. So I think these are more the expectations which I want to focus on. And now, why do expectations matter? I think there are 3 at least very, very good reasons why they matter. First of all, our expectations are crucial for making long and medium-term plans, right? So we can only make plans if we have certain expectations about the future. Some of these might be ill-founded expectations, so, and I come back to that later, so they might be less important, but there are certain expectations which we have to the framework we're going to move in. So that leads to the third point here of the why do expectations matter, namely that states play a crucial role, right, in a formative role in shaping expectations. Not all expectations, but a lot. Other things, of course, as well, like the kind of social organization, production processes, do you live in a market economy or not? These kind of things shape expectations. And these expectations, they're not only crucial for making plans, but also they're often very difficult to adapt to changing circumstances, especially if the circumstances change dramatically. Or it might be even impossible, right? So if you have the expectation that you will be able to be employed being a philosopher, and then it actually turns out that there are no more jobs for philosophers, you cannot just change that expectation, right? You can change what you are. I could stop being a philosopher or whatever, but that's a different kind of thing. So, but then the question, if we agree that expectations might matter, right, then the question is, do all expectations matter? Are there only certain expectations that we really should care about? So that is normally a debate between legitimate expectations, well, singling out what legitimate expectations are, and what kind of expectations are illegitimate, which is, again, a bit crude. So quite often, and I will come back to that in a second, if you look at the debate, you have the feeling an expectation either needs to be legitimate or illegitimate. That's all right. What is this for?
It's for this.
Ah, okay. Grant. You lost PowerPoint.
I thought it was amazing news. I was waiting for you to explain how to fit it in.
On screen, everything was fine. Right, so we have to find out a way what are legitimate expectations, what are illegitimate expectations. Now, quite many expectations we have are status quo based. So it's just because we're used to how the world is that we assume that the world is going to be like this in the future, one way or another. And obviously, if you then consider different scenarios, you might think that makes an expectation illegitimate. So philosophers obviously always like quite drastic and striking examples. Think about the slaveholder society. you might expect, yeah, there should be slaves in the future, right? I'm a slaveholder, so everything should be granted in the future as well. Surely I'm entitled to have slaves in the future as well. You might say, well, yes, maybe that's how the world was, but that's not a legitimate expectation to hold. Why? There are two possibilities to respond to that. Some say, so some have legitimacy-based accounts and others have justice-based accounts. Legitimacy-based accounts are basically about the circumstances under which the expectations are formed. So is the kind of regime in which you form the expectations, which is formative in forming your expectations, is that legitimate? And quite many people would say, look, a slaveholder society clearly is not legitimate. If we believe in shared universal rights and so on, there's no way we can consider them legitimate. Another way to arrive at the same conclusion is your expectations are not compatible with what justice requires. Now, there you have a narrow and a wide interpretation. The narrow interpretation requires that we know exactly what justice is, right? And then you say either your expectations are compatible with justice or not. Now, most of us, especially in the real world, obviously, might have some reasonable disagreement about what justice entails. So Lucas, Maya, and Pranay Sanklecha, for instance, go for the wider account of justice-based legitimate expectations. They say it's not about knowing exactly what justice requires, it's being able to determine the rough ballpark of what justice requires. And if we have that rough ballpark, we know that there's a range of conceptions of justice which are possible under that, and as long as our expectations fit this range of conceptions, everything is fine. I have a worry about the justice-based conceptions when it comes to the real world, namely that the disagreement about justice might be bigger than what we as philosophers sitting in armchairs discussing abstract principles might anticipate. So if you use a too strongly justice-based account, A, you might exclude quite many expectations, where I'm not sure that you want to say they're not legitimate, hence they're illegitimate. So one way around that, of course, would be to come up with a third category and say, just because they're not legitimate doesn't mean they're illegitimate. There's something like neutral expectations in the middle. Or you could say, and that's the route I prefer, you can say there are actually quite a few legitimate expectations because they were formed on the basis on relatively good reasons. They are informed by an understanding of how society works. They have something to do with the state being that framework and society as such, of course, being a framework, forming expectations that certain norms continue to exist. So there's a certain legitimacy requirement in there. And the justice requirement is quite thin in the sense that they just shouldn't... I can tell you, you don't miss a lot. It continues, like it's red headlines and then black bullet points, because I left it to the last minute. So I'll just continue. You have to bear with me, I'm afraid. So I think a better way is to say, look, we first consider more expectations to be legitimate, and then we see whether these legitimate expectations give rise to claims for compensation. Rather than, and that seems to be the Myers and Fletcher way, to say once we know that expectations are legitimate, it's a very short way to compensation. That seems to be wrong for me. I think you can have legitimate expectations without a claim to compensation right away from the state. And here I briefly want to do something, especially since we're in France, namely go quickly to the legal world, so to the real world, where obviously I feel deeply uncomfortable. But then sometimes it's helpful. I mean, if we look at legal norms and doctrines, on the one hand, of course, it's philosophically neither here or there, right? Just because there are certain laws or legal doctrines doesn't mean that they're right. But sometimes legal scholars are really good at providing us with certain criteria which we want to take into consideration to make sure to assess certain claims. So if you go into administrative law, unfortunately England is a bad example, so it's much nicer to be in France. You have a strong legal tradition of taking expectations, legitimate expectations, serious. So in France, you have the principe de confiance légitime. I hope I didn't slaughter that too much. And you have similar things in the European Union. So, and in Germany, though it's different, not quite as prominent as in France. And what that basically means is that the state and its administration, whether it's local or regional or national, though in France it's mainly local and regional, interestingly enough, might under certain conditions have the liability to compensate for frustrated or non-fulfilled legitimate expectations. What is interesting is that that is not a straightforward thing, though. So certain conditions need to be fulfilled, and not always all at the same time. So if you look at some European Union cases from the European Court of Justice, it's really interesting because they have found that compensation needs to be paid on the basis of frustrated legitimate expectations, which is, I think, normatively, philosophically really interesting. But they connected it to certain other requirements being fulfilled. So one famous case is about peasants suing the European Commission and saying, look, what you did, or no, actually it was in the Netherlands, the Dutch Ministry for Environmental Affairs. They said, look, what you've done, your policy changes mean that we can't engage further in milk production. And we had the legitimate expectation to continue to be able to do that. Now, as it turns out, though, there was prior assurance from the Dutch government that it would be possible, even after the policy changes, to engage in milk production. So that was what normatively tipped the scales there, right? So the court said, you provided that assurance, and then actually under your new rules, it doesn't really seem to be possible. That's a problem. Now, what is important about that kind of assurance is that it was non-contractual, right? Because we care about expectations, or the kind of expectations we care about here are non-contractual ones. If you had a contract, it would be very different. You can invoke all kinds of other principles there. So they're not explicitly codified normally in writing either. So it might just be, so in this case, I think it was the minutes from a consultation meeting of interest groups and the ministry which showed that there had been an assurance made, and that tipped the scales. Another interesting example is somebody who imported fruit into the European Union. The European Union changed its regulation. It was perceived to be A, a sudden policy change of rather drastic nature, and B, that the losses which the fruit importer incurred were beyond inherent business risk. So there are two elements there. One is that the policy change needs to be really sudden and drastical. And the second is that you have to incur certain losses which go beyond what you might be professionally expected to accept as a risk anyway. And I think that becomes interesting when you look, for instance, at the energy sector, right? So one of the questions you could ask with energy companies is, for how long did you know that you might run into trouble if you depend too much on fossil fuels, right? So is that really a sudden policy change? If we now really had a sudden policy change in the European Union, for instance, and we really went gung-ho on fossil fuels and said, no, that's no more, we're putting everything into renewables. Even though I think it's not a question that it would be a really sudden and drastic policy change, would the losses connected to that, for instance, be beyond the inherent business risk, right? So if you had time to plan in a certain way, if you say, okay, since the 1990s, mid-90s, 2000, you knew that something was, that pressure was mounting, how much could you expect certain players to adjust their behavior? That is, of course, an argument you can make much better with companies than with employees, right, in the energy sector. So what do you expect people to do? Leave their okay paid job when the social security that goes with that and retrain on the assumption that the world might change? That doesn't seem to be particularly feasible, right? So with the individual, the responsibility seems to be somewhat different there. What is interesting from the legal case, and I think it fits quite nicely with my attempt to expand the category of legitimate expectations a little bit from how Lucas and Pranay do it is, he says, there are lots of individual legitimate expectations. Stakeholders have expectations, but it's normally in the legal process, it's about balancing it with public interest and really looking, in order to assess compensation claims, you need to have really good reasons to argue that your expectations trump the underlying public interest which normally drives the policy change in the first place. So was this venture into the real world helpful? I hope it was on the one hand because it gives us some criteria which we might take on board. And on the other hand, it shows us how at the moment already in the real world partially legitimate expectations are dealt with. Now, Alexander Brown actually makes a similar move and then goes on to go back to normative theory, and he says, well, that's all nice and well, but like as normative theories, shall we think for a second how we should deal with expectations and what we expect the state to do? Because at the beginning I talked a little bit about duties of the state. I talked now several times already about the framework making that the state provides. Should we go for something which he calls the precept of administrative liability for the non-fulfillment of legitimate expectations? And Alex Brown uses a Rawlsian model and says, look, the Rawlsian parties in the original position behind the veil of ignorance, they're risk averse. That's one of these things we know about them. So surely they would choose a policy which gives them a little bit more protection against too radical institutional change by the state. So in a certain way, it seems quite clear that we would choose something like administrative liability for the non-fulfillment of legitimate expectations. I think that is possibly a step too far. Why? Because that seems to put the onus right away on the state always having to justify why they don't compensate for all sorts of frustrations of legitimate expectations. Now, the way I understand legitimate expectations, to make that clear again, is wide, relatively wide. So I think there's a fair bunch of legitimate expectations out there, which though also means that they're being frustrated all the time, right? So, and I think that's one of these things about, right, the difference between justice and leading the perfect life. If you were going to lead the perfect life, then maybe your expectations wouldn't be frustrated. But that doesn't mean that you have a claim of justice, if that's not the case, right? So justice shouldn't be confused with that. So I think that goes a step too far. Back to the case at hand, because now, as I warned you initially, I was going to talk a lot about expectations, but actually I wanted to say something about energy transition. And when I read well, it was not really a call for papers, but your description of the workshop, Jérémy, you said, well, these are some of the questions we would like to address. Do we owe compensation to people working in the energy industry and to companies? And I thought, I just want to say something about that, even if I don't have very good arguments to back up my initial hunch. So, and that's my last slide because I'm running short on time. So, I think importantly, first of all, it's important to resist an impulse of looking only at one case, so for instance, energy transition, and say, look, the rich companies, it doesn't really hurt them that they lose a certain amount of business. They have the ability to pay. We shouldn't care about them. And that's something which came out yesterday, again, over dinner. John and I talked a little bit about it. I'm sometimes worried in the climate literature that we make too much of the ability to pay, right? So it's okay if we think that the ability to pay has a lot to do with historical responsibility, and they're definitely tied up. But otherwise, I'm not sure that just because you're well off doesn't always mean that you definitely should be the one carrying the burden. I think there needs to be further argument for that. We might still end up in the same place, but I think for different reasons, namely by thinking about how it affects social vulnerability and so on. Also, I'm slightly worried, and that came out yesterday very briefly as well, if you say, oh, well, the rich person, he or she could have foreseen that. They didn't have the same structural constraints as the poor person who didn't have a choice what to do. So we hold them responsible in a different way than that we hold responsible the poor person. I just always want to get away from the responsibility conception there too much, because I'm always afraid I run back into luck egalitarian kind of things. But maybe that's a disciplinary worry only for philosophers who either are luck egalitarians or, like myself, think that luck egalitarianism is a really bad idea. But the deeper point to that, I think, is that one needs to look at the overall scheme, right, of risk distribution, but also dealing with legitimate expectations. Oh, I still have 5 minutes. I don't have to rush. Okay, well, 3 minutes will do, I think. So that means that we probably should go back about what go back to what I said earlier, namely that we have to think about first basic need fulfillment, then think about the capability, so the things we value, the certain kinds of capabilities and functionings that we think are important for people to be social equals. And that gives us a better kind of normative yardstick to assess who should shoulder the burden. When it comes to compensation claims, I think what one also needs to keep in mind is obviously, of course, there are different kinds of compensation, right? So means replacement, ends replacement, and so on. But quite often it seems to be only about financial payment, the way the literature perceives it. But if that's the case, then one always needs to think about where the payments actually come from, right? So again, if you think that you don't want to make too many changes to a tax regime or something like that, right, then you might have a transfer from people who are not that well off to compensation for energy companies, and that would be really worrying, I think. I don't think that the lower middle class and the working class should pay for the compensation of energy companies, for instance. So I think there, one of the questions is whether you need a special mechanism to pay into a fund that you say, we need a compensation fund, or we need a climate transition fund, and how you fund that. And I think that would be a better way to separate the direct financial costs away from other issues. If you just take it from the general budget, you have the problem that you might, in the end, have at least partially the wrong people paying for compensations for better off. In general, though, I think that the trickiest issue is probably with the individual, and not in terms of compensation or legitimate expectations, but because if you look at the issue of the person who falls unemployed because of changes in society, it's about the wider mechanisms and policies which are in place so that the state actually fulfills its other duties, right, as the opportunity-giving kind of framework, as so providing opportunities for employment, providing good benefits for those who are unemployed and these kind of things. And that's actually where we're really struggling. So it actually goes back that it's not a climate transition problem. It's actually the problem we already have without climate transition, that we live in a state, basically all of us, live in states where already the poor get the short end of the stick too often, and especially so under, obviously, politics of austerity. So it actually leads back again to the other inequality issue. So that you actually say, this discussion, yes, was nice, but it might be too atomist at the end again, because you actually want to tie it in with the wider issues and say the states have other duties which they ought to fulfill, and actually they might not be fulfilling them, and whether we then have to engage in social disobedience is a question I leave up to Simon, who talks about these things in other papers of his. And last but not least, of course, I think it's important to stress, but that's always a slightly pragmatic point, is that there are going to be winners and losers, right, in any transition. So you're not going to make everybody equally well off. There will be people who are worse off because of a transition. But important is that they don't fall below certain thresholds. So again, I think it's about making sure that, first of all, certain needs are fulfilled, fertile functionings, depending on what your framework is. But then make sure that no matter what kind of negative impacts you have, because some people will have negative impacts, it will be difficult to adequately compensate them for it, especially if we think that engaging in individual compensation might be too complex. That society as a whole works in such a way that they are not put in particularly vulnerable positions. And with this big picture comment, I finish here. Thank you.
We are running a bit over time, so what I'm just going to do is push the break back a little bit, start Larry's paper a little bit late, if that's all right, and have a little bit less time for lunch. These are the sacrifices we make. So, who would like to ask a question? Gordon? John? Yep. Oh, Daryl? Yep.
I enjoyed your legal excursion. I thought it was very useful. It made me think about grandfather rights, particularly around minerals. And there's a sort of long history of mining, quarrying companies having established, certainly in the UK, I don't know about elsewhere, having established rights to exploitation, particular bodies of minerals, sort of decades and decades ago, and being able to just carry on that because it was a right established historically. So I can think of, a hill near where I used to live in the UK on the edge of the Peak District that gradually disappeared in a way that was extraordinary to imagine that permission would be given to do that now. So is there sort of legal precedent to look back at those sort of mineral cases and where grandfather rights have been set against the sort of levels of harm that are seen to be done by either the historic or the continued exploitation of those mineral rights, which can somehow be applied into the sort of carbon-related questions you're dealing with?
That's a very, very good question. So I have to flag up that I'm not an expert on environmental law. However, there are two cases come to mind. So one issue is always, of course, the underlying contractual kind of situation. So I did a project in South Africa earlier this year on mining, and there the problem is that quite many of the contracts are really long term. So then it's a contract, which just means it's not about grandfathering rights, right? Even though it feels a little bit like the circumstances have changed and there should be a possibility to renegotiate that, but quite often people are not foresighted enough, so they don't. There was nothing in place, right? So then it's just bad luck. In Germany, in the Ruhr area, there were overruling public interest concerns to stop certain coal exploration operations that have been going on for decades. Again, there I think the issue was helped by the fact that there was no different kind of contract underlying that. It was just they had been granted permission to go ahead, dig up the coal, and then just the circumstances changed. I think it was first the regional government and then the federal government came in and said, look, this is not working, you can't do that, there are overarching public interest concerns, but I haven't seen it, but again, it's not my main area. I haven't seen a direct, where you first had an admission of grandfathering rights, if you will, and then later coming in and saying no grandfather rights. But maybe there are people in the audience who have greater expertise on these matters than I have. But it's a very pertinent point, obviously, the grandfathering, yeah.
Thanks for the paper. It was really good, and it might help me. I'm just hoping you'll help me in a debate I'm having at the moment. It's a really nice debate with George Monbiot, right, around rewelding, and it's about sources of legitimate expectations and whether this is the right way of thinking about it, and also kinds of when you talk about different kinds of compensation. So with thinking specifically about debate about hill farmers and shepherds. Right. Now, it seems to me there's lots of reasons why you might want to protect hill farming and shepherds, and one is to do about a way of life, which contains a certain kind of virtues. And I think that's and it's interesting. It's not come up as a dilemma for environmentalists on the left, but you would have had the same dilemma with mining communities in the UK. Very, very, very similar things, that there's a kind of way of life and a set of communities and solidarities associated with that, which have got real virtues. And you want, so it's not status quo, but it's not justice or, I forgot the other one you had, the legitimate. It's to do with, you know, there's a legitimacy in having a way of life like this because look at the virtues associated with it. Now, one of George's responses to that, and I think he's got, and so there's an argument for getting rid of Shepherds, not because of rewelding, but because of carbon, right? That they, and it's just come. The last emails we had was exactly about this. So that he's saying, well, look, if there's carbon emissions and there's carbon storage problems that come from hill farming, so we can. So okay. So he's, you know, if we got rid of hill farming, right, what would count as adequate compensation? Well, immediately people talk in terms of money, in terms of income and employment. Yeah. And my kind of response to that is that's not really adequate because what you've lost is a way of life. Right, so what you need something like is meaningful work, or so it's not just an income or just employment and so on. So it seems to me, and I just wonder how much that fits in with this framework about whether you're thinking in terms of how this fits into a legitimate expectations and compensation framework, right? Or whether I should be thinking of it in terms of another. Right.
No, I think in many ways it fits really well. So there are people who obviously work on these issues. So Claire Hayward, right, one of her things are about cultural loss.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, connected to climate change. And that is part of the issue here, right? So you do not just lose employment, you lose a way of life. The problem there always is, so is it just the way of life, losing the way of life, which is problematic, or is it the virtues associated with it?
I was going to say, for me, it's the virtues, because there's ways of life that get lost, which you think, thank goodness they're getting lost. Right.
The American way of life is always put up, right?
Exactly.
Like,
so I'm not into cultural biodiversity. If you read Seven Pillars of Wisdom, and you've got he's got defences of slavery in there.
Yes.
Right, and you think, well, okay, that's going to get lost, but fine. Right.
Yeah.
So I'm not, there's lots of ways of life I'm happy to go, but what I think it comes out with kind of mining communities and shepherding is like there's pastoral virtues there. There's real loss of something that has independent value. Right,
absolutely. So there's very interesting growing literature on different forms of compensation, so means replacement and ends replacement, but also that there might be things we cannot compensate for, right? We just lose them. And what shall we do in those cases? Because the problem is, of course, so loss of your homeland, for instance, as well, right? You can't really compensate for that.
Yeah.
I could give you a beautiful flat in Paris, and you might think that's great, but it's still not your homeland, right? So I think it is really, so it fits into this kind of discussion. The problem is, as far as I know, there are not any perfect answers to that yet, right? Because you have to, so some things you can take care of, and you make sure that people somehow are able to participate socially, right? By giving them employment, by giving them housing, by giving them rights, access to certain services. The problem is if they also lose a certain kind of self-identification, right? But there the problem is then that you move into the subjective bit as well, right? So whose claim that they actually lost an integral part of who they are, whose of those claims are legitimate and whose are not, right? So with the mining communities, I think, for instance, that's a really tricky one, because you think on the one hand, yes, of course that is your shared history and all that, and there are many things which go hand in hand with it, but does it mean you have to do mining in the same kind of way, or could you take care of the land somehow differently? With the farming communities, it's slightly different. So my answer is, I'm not sure I can help you, but I would love to talk with you about it in more detail when I don't have Jérémy breathing down my neck.
Okay.
So Daryl Simon Fergus was the list to date.
Well, I'd like to ask about two things, but having been a chair, if Jérémy says that I can only ask about one, I'll understand.
Fine.
Okay.
Really
so the first is about to what extent content of expectations matters when it comes to legitimate expectations. So your slave owning example, of course, I mean, what strikes us about that, why these aren't legitimate expectations to continue to own slaves, is the content of the expectation itself, right? But the legal expectations that you, the sort of legal criteria that you put up for legitimate expectations say nothing about the content of the expectations, nothing at all. And presumably, I mean, I'm guessing that that's because these operate under a background constitutional system in which the thought is that human rights are assured and that sort of thing. And presumably they work pretty well for things like the taking of lands for public purposes and that sort of thing, where it doesn't look like the content of expectations is really an issue. But if we come to understand something as being an injustice that we didn't understand as being an injustice before, presumably we think that it's always been an injustice. It's just that our moral thinking about it has changed. And climate change might be like that. So it might be that climate change is this case in which what we're involved in is committing an injustice vis-a-vis future generations. And then I wonder if it's not more like, in a certain way, more like the slave case, and the content matters here too, in a profoundly important way, and not that's just not captured by these criteria of prior assurance, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm wondering what you think about that. And then the second is, so I like the ability to pay principle, and I think it's right on, and I think it's the one that really matters. And I didn't really understand your reference to the worry about funding compensation from a general budget, because I mean, presumably we're talking about states here, and we're talking about state budgets, and we're talking about minimally redistributive estates, if not more so, and the budget is acquired by means of progressive taxation, which of course just is the inability to pay principle. So I would think that that's exactly the way to go, right, is to fund these sorts of things out of the general budget. It's not laying a heavy burden on the working class, on the middle class. It's just laying proportionally a much heavier burden on the wealthy, and that's the way we ought to go.
Thank you very much. In terms of the first one, so just to clarify that, these criteria are criteria mentioned in legal proceedings in order to establish whether legitimate expectations, that they're already legitimate, give rise to claims of compensation. So those are criteria for compensation, not whether expectations are legitimate or not. When you go back, though, to what makes expectations legitimate, yeah, the content, of course, matters. So that's the totally justified criticism, obviously, of Mayans and Kletcher of a purely legitimacy-based account, where it's only is the system in which the expectations were formed legitimate in some kind of sense. Because you can imagine a good system in which people still come up with the wrong kind of expectations. So certain things are ruled out because of the system, but you can imagine a system which gives people equal rights, but allows for deeply sexist division of society. If you then develop deeply sexist expectations, hopefully we wouldn't think they're legitimate, right? So, so the content matters. Clearly, that's where the justice-based concern comes in. The question is, what kind of weight do you attribute to the connection between the content of the expectation and how it relates to a certain conception of justice? So in the narrow sense, it's really you have to know what justice is and then you just check, right? Is that compatible with justice? That doesn't seem to be particularly feasible because we first have to agree what justice is. Not even, people I really like, and I can agree on that. So even more difficult in society. So then you can go slightly wider. Or then I said, it's about being slightly wider, but it's also about being realistic in a certain way about expectations and just say, what you want to do with the content is to weed out, the content criterion has to weed out expectations which are really content-wise really off. So it's not about making sure that they're as close as possible to a set of possible theories of justice, but that they're clearly not unjust, clearly not discriminatory, clearly not, one of these things which we can all agree probably shouldn't be part of what makes a legitimate expectation. So I just thought, so my only proposal there is just to say, clearly content matters, but relax the justice condition a little bit and rather focus that they're not clearly unjust. And then you deal with them later in the social process, because I don't connect the idea of legitimacy of expectations to compensation, which is a little bit how it looks in what Lucas and Pranay are doing in their papers. They, I think, put too much weight on the legitimacy condition and then seem to think that compensation more or less follows from that. And I don't think that's the case. You can have lots of legitimate expectations, but there's no claim to compensation. And rightly so, I think. With your second point, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm not against the APP as such, so I'm clearly for progressive taxation, yes. The point I was getting at more is, and sometimes in debates you have a strong difference is being made between how we treat people who are not well off in comparison to how we treat people who are well off. And I think if we have to figure out how we distribute burdens, yes, we might quite often end up with the APP, but it should not be our automatic starting point. We first should see whether there are other normative criteria, and the APP comes much further down, I think, because that's then just a good, principle to resolve the problem that we don't have another principle which can do the normative work. So I see the APP always a little bit, coming a little bit later, because what the APP allows us to do is to make sure that we don't overburden the ones who don't have enough anyway already, or who are close to not having enough. So that's why I like the APP, but further down. So I absolutely agree with that. The only point about the general budget and the funds was a slight worry that there might be, and setting up a separate fund might be that there is the case that if you take money out of the general budget, that as we see with austerity politics and so on, where the cuts then are being made is again on the poor because they don't have the lobby. But that's a very pessimistic and non-ideal assumption, and I, of course, totally agree that it's not a necessary feature of taking it out of the pot. I just think there might be ways of, especially if we think the APP is the right principle, of taxing wealth or capital or both, and rather set up funds separately and say, look, we need to shoulder these burdens. You're in a position to do that, but that's an imperfect solution. So leave it there.
All right. Simon?
Thank you very much, Fabian. Actually, I have a more sort of basic question. I didn't quite get what a legitimacy-based account was, because it could mean it's just compatible with some very thin, basic principles of justice, but also it could mean that it was made in a political regime that honours, certain principles of human rights. Or I thought it could mean that it was a kind of a reasonable thing for people to plan, knowing what they knew at the time, even though it might turn out to be false, which Parfit calls a sort of an evidence relative notion, where you might think, well, is legitimate in the sense of, I could see why you would do that, but actually it turns out to be. So I know you're talking about the Maya Sanketchka there, but I thought it makes a difference as to how one appraises that. So I'm just being a bit slow on what that means. But the second thing is, I wondered about the normative significance of cases where people violate legitimate expectations. Because the legitimate expectations framing is very much focused on a victim. And it has a sort of status quo bias, because it's focused on those who have often been, let's say, assured that what they currently have will not suddenly be taken away. And so it's tilted in favour of those that have. Of course, those could be poor people who, the vulnerable that John was describing. But if you look at who's paying, as you see, one of your later questions, I was just wondering whether someone might say, yeah, X had a legitimate expectation, Y violated that, but it doesn't follow from that X should be compensated. Because often the people making the decisions are not people with the money. So here's an example from Axel Gossery's I thought was quite persuasive. He said, imagine government officials start taxing car use, and they do it the week after when people traditionally buy lots of cars because they get a new number plate. They could have done it before, and then people would have bought different cars. But they do it a week after when people have bought the cars, and they could have turned around to the government and said, you could have told us in advance. Now what follows from that? Maybe the government officials should lose their job, right? It doesn't follow that everyone else suddenly has to pay a lot of money. So I guess what I'm wondering is how we theorize about the normative significance of that. And it's not just purely about compensation. It might be about political accountability. And you might just say, yeah, you were wronged. That's really bad. The guy has lost his or her job. End. Right. So could you say a bit more how... I know you did talk about who should pay and talk about the general pot, but I guess I just think it's often political actors making decisions, and it shouldn't be fellow citizens who are coughing up the money, especially given the status quo bias of legitimate expectations.
Yeah. So first, really quickly on the first question. So the legitimacy-based account, the literature is thin, as you know, on these issues, but the way it's normally presented is because of the formative role of the state, the institutions which form your forming of your expectations need to have a minimal kind of legitimacy condition fulfilled, right? So that's why I said it kind of is in the conception of that they need to be formed under the right circumstances. So the justice-based concern is really about the content of the expectation. The legitimacy account is not about the content of the expectation. It's about that you were, if you want to say, justified in forming the expectation, considering that there are institutions which justifiably, legitimately frame your forming of your expectations. Yes?
That's my confusion, because you could have a legitimate political regime, but people make stupid decisions that are ill-informed. So it seems that like a legitimate political regime is a necessary feature of that, but it can't be sufficient.
Well, it depends, right? I mean, that's the criticism of the legitimacy-based account, right? So in a certain way, I think that's exactly what I said, why I don't think the legitimacy-based account is a good account. That's precisely that worry. So I think we're actually just sharing the same worry. But, right?
Well, so, someone could think, I'm not talking about the content of it.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, is it reasonable for them to form that view? It's sort of a procedural one. And given the evidence available, was it a justified belief, even though it wasn't a true one? And someone might say, actually, it doesn't serve the cause of justice in a substantive sense, but you formed it in good faith with relevant information. And that seems to me not a justice-based account. It's not a legitimacy account as the Maya Sankecha view, but it is a kind of a procedural legitimacy.
Yes.
And I thought that's not a crazy view. It's not immediately false.
No, yeah. So I probably should have mentioned that. So I mean, with all three of these accounts, normally you have a certain kind of procedural condition underneath, right? That you say, you need to have good reasons to form this particular view, right? So it's definitely not justified true belief, right? But it's somewhat a justified belief in that sense. So, if you will, there's a difference between being justified in forming an expectation and that expectation being legitimate, right? And this bit is only about the expectation being legitimate, not whether you're justified in forming that expectation, because those three accounts seem to agree on that there are certain kind of more procedural requirements. And obviously it goes tightly hand in hand with some of the status quo accounts, which just say, look, take the world as it is, reason adequately, and you can form certain expectations, and how we then deal with them, that's a later issue. But that's why status quo accounts quite often just say all expectations formed under these conditions are legitimate, and I think that's too simple. But yeah. So, and on this second point, in terms of the normative significance of violating expectations, I think that's exactly the difficult bit. So I think expectations in a certain way matter, right? They give us reasons. But as with reasons in general, there are better and worse reasons. And certainly it's not the case, and that's why it's important to me to make the difference between legitimate expectations and cases for compensation. I don't think that there's a necessary connection between holding legitimate expectations and having a claim to compensation. Just the opposite. So I think, well, I mean, not the opposite, but I mean, there are so many cases where, you have an expectation. And of course you have an expectation that your government official could tell you that they are going to change the rules prior to National Auto Buying Day rather than after. Yes, of course, but like you, I would say, well, yeah, maybe the official, should get, I'm not even sure the official should get sacked, probably just a slap on the wrist and say, come on, that wasn't very nice of you. But, I mean, so I think really the point is that expectations in a certain way always seem to have a fairly, quite often minimal normative purchase. But it's interesting to identify those which then really actually have that kind of normative purchase, where you say, that's a good reason to actually come back to society, and whether that's the state and the state institutions, or whether then that in the end means that your fellow citizens pay. But that obviously has something to do with how you generate the funds for the compensation anyway, right? And that's a separate issue. So one issue is to talk about legitimate expectations, make clear that they're quite often not normatively that significant, but I think it would be wrong to dismiss them out of hand. I think there are cases where expectations actually matter, and especially when it comes to life world scenarios, cultural loss, these kind of things, because you can't do that with contract. You can't, and that, I think their expectation, I can't think of a different concept which as neatly qualifies that.
Fergus, we'll make this the last question.
Thanks. So I think maybe one way of kind of avoiding the confusion with the nomenclature is just to make clear that the Meyer and Sinclair kind of case is, so I wouldn't call it a legitimacy. I would focus on the regime bit, right? Because I think the question we're asking here is, what is the legitimacy basis? So I think that's the broad question. And then one potential basis is the kind of regime legitimacy, right? And so then you're focusing on the qualities that the underlying regime has. And then one is to focus on kind of, the sort of the content of the expectation. And that might help, because I think by calling that legitimacy and this one justice, I think that maybe contributes to the confusion. I guess, so my more general comment is, I think what's interesting about this topic is when you get into questions of the legitimacy basis, you very quickly find yourself sort of knee deep in political theory and in kind of in meta-ethics. So on the kind of justice-based accounts, and you've already alluded to this, right? You're kind of quickly going, well, what is the nature of justice, and is it universal and across time, and do we just have to discover it, and what are the kind of epistemic constraints we have about discovering justice, and those kind of things. And I agree with Simon, actually. I think it's worth this. There's something important there, but one partial way to kind of get around it a bit is this question of a more procedural-oriented account. And there, I think, then you're then you're knee deep in political theory, which is fine, but like I think be explicit about that, because I think if you're a Republican, then you have much greater expectations of the kind of efforts that citizens ought to put into to kind of gain access to information, to question, well, also to question the justice of existing policies. But and so if you're kind of in a republican regime where your underlying institutions are more suited to that, then you might have higher expectations for citizens. Yeah. Whereas if you're in a kind of liberal system, then you might have more minimal expectations. So I think that's a really interesting area to explore. But I think you're also right to kind of separate those questions then from this larger question of, okay, let's say you do have a legitimate expectation. What are the implications of that? The way I would kind of resolve it is thinking of, if you have a legitimate expectation, then that maybe gives a pro tanto claim to transitional relief, which is a slightly larger category than compensation. But that's just one claim among others, and then there might be other claims that are stronger. And again, I think is sort of a political theory kind of point, is that, you know, maybe a sort of libertarian or kind of certain kind of Kantians would say, well, these legitimate expectations should be strong, and so they do have a very strong kind of status quo bias, or kind of ideas of pure Pareto improvement in normative public economics as well. So you sort of have to, I think, delve into those questions, and sort of the literature, I think, often avoids those questions and leaves a lot unstated, but I think we're kind of playing in the right space. So, and just very quickly, on the grandfathering point, I don't know if you've come across the Luke Boven's paper on lock-in. Yeah, that's kind of one that's dealt with that. And also John Broome and Duncan Foley have a working paper on a World Climate Bank, and part of that's about financing the transition, and part of that is also about compensating all of the losers, because they want to actually achieve dealing with climate change through a pure Pareto improvement. I disagree with a lot of it, but it's an interesting paper, and it does go into this issue of kind of compensating everyone in this field. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. I will take all of those as comments, if you don't mind, and respond over coffee, so that we're not...
Take a couple of minutes, that's right.
Okay. You're very relaxed. That's living up to the Australian stereotype.
That one, that's all.
No, I take your point on board with the regime and not the legitimacy. That's actually a good point. I have to admit I just took the legitimacy bit straight out of the Meyer and St. Fletcher paper, and just said, okay. The procedure, which Simon already mentioned, yeah, I probably have to spend more time on that and actually see how that, if that possibility is not just an underlying kind of conception that they agree on, but it actually offers an alternative of thinking about legitimate expectations per se. That's a good point, but I think I need more than 2 minutes to come up to say something intelligent about that. In terms of the pro tanto claim, I like to think about expectations more really along the line of reasons in this case. So with the claim, so that's the brown bit, right? With this precept of administrative liability and so on, I just don't think that there's a strong connection between the expectation and the claim on somebody else, because you only have a claim on somebody, on something. And that seems to be so... Yeah, that worries me somehow, especially if we think about expectations, and that's obviously Simon's point, which I didn't respond to adequately, that quite often these expectation-based arguments are made by the people who have, right, and not by the have-nots, because you're much more concerned about losing what you have than rather losing what you never were able to get your hands on in the first place. But I do think that there's a way around the have-not issue by just being very careful in distinguishing different kinds of expectations which you might call initially legitimate or justified or okay to hold within the social context. And then in terms of how you process them with regard to compensation claims, make sure that you are very sensitive to the status quo bias there. And I think that's not impossible. Again, I think it needs to tie in with concerns for vulnerability, with concerns for different kinds of losses or damages you can suffer, even though it's not about loss and damage in that sense necessarily. and talk about also the kind of risk which you can expect to take, because in the case of having, quite often we have, but we have, and we should be aware that there's a risk that we lose it, rather than we have and we assume that we are just going to keep it in perpetuity, and but that is a controversial claim, and my family always looks at me like, what? when I voice these things.
All right. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Fabian for his paper. Now we have a little less than 10 minutes to rush.